Hey everyone, it's Tobes, and welcome to your second monitor. Today is the next video in our series of Edge of Eternities Commander deck techs. Since EOE is Magic's last in-universe set for 2025, I wanted to showcase some of the cool commander options that it's given us beyond just the ones from the precons. I'm releasing a new Edge of Eternities commander deck every Thursday through September when the Spider-Man set drops, in addition to my usual Monday commander deck tech videos. So if you have a request for an Edge of Eternities commander you'd like to see me build, let me know in the comments below. As you see, today our commander is Dyadrine, Synthesis Amalgam. The Mechan drone was abandoned on an uncharted moon, and in order to repair itself, Dyadrine discovered that the moon's flora was strong enough to use. Over time, it came to see itself as more than a symbiote and host, evolving into a unified being, both organic and mechanical, and it's finding its own niche in the local ecosystem. This is just another example of how good the world building is in Edge of Eternities. I've linked the EOE story in the description below, so check it out. Before we get into the deck tech, let's go over my deck building template. I like to build around the commander card. I don't want to just have a cool piece in the command zone that's in the colors I'm trying to build for. I want to show off what the card actually does and why it's cool. So I put about 30 cards toward my game plan. It's what I'm doing at the table and how I'm trying to win with this deck. 30 more cards go in about an even split into support for that game plan. Card advantage is like draw spells, acceleration is sort of like ramp generally, and interaction is spot removal. I'll do some mass removal as well in the form of wraths. Sometimes I do more than that if it would feed into the game plan, and sometimes, like today, there are no wraths because I've got a lot of creatures I want to keep on the battlefield. Finally, I have a floor of 38 lands because I want to cast my spells and, play Magic. So let's talk about our commander. Dyadrine Synthesis Amalgam is a 0/1 legendary construct for X, a green, and a white. Dyadrine has 0 power but has trample, and it says that Dyadrine enters with a number of +1/+1 counters equal to the amount of mana spent to cast it. So that means, by default, if we just spend a green and a white, we can, and we'll get a 0/1 creature with 2 counters on it. Because it's not just the amount of mana we put into the X, it's the amount of mana we spend to cast it. Notably, that includes the commander tax. So let's say Dyadrine has died and gone back to the command zone. If we cast it for X equals 0, let's say, or let's make it simple, we'll cast it for X equals 1. Then we're paying 1, a white, and a green, and then 2 more for the commander tax. That is 5 mana we've spent to cast it, so it will enter with 5 counters on it. So Dyadrine it doesn't really reward us for letting it go back to the command zone, but we're not as penalized as we are with some other commanders. In addition, Dyadrine says, whenever you attack, you may remove a +1/+1 counter from each of 2 creatures you control. If you do, draw a card and create a 2/2 colorless robot artifact creature token. So Dyadrine wants you to remove not just 2 counters from somewhere on your board, but it has to be 1 counter from each of 2 creatures. You can't take 2 counters directly off Dyadrine, that's not good enough. It's gotta be 2 different creatures. And if you do, you get a robot and you get a card. So I know you're looking at Dyadrine, thinking about all the cool ways to build it, and wondering one thing above all else. Why is it a construct rather than a robot? This is Edge of Eternities. I can only surmise that the answer is that it's now more than just a very good bot, integrating plants into itself until it became a construct of a new sort. And the lore suggests that it even wants to propagate itself, which is why when it eats counters, it creates robot tokens of its own. As it grows, it builds a family. So we're giving it one. Our deck is a Selesnyan classic, go wide counters. But we aren't trying to go too tall as well. We pay special attention to cards that spread counters around. We want to take advantage of Dyadrine's triggered ability and turn the shared growth of 2 of our creatures into a new robot friend to add to the board, as well as a new card to add to our hand. This is about cooperation, sharing, interdependence. It's not enough to become greater than oneself. We want to be the rising tide that lifts all boats. Life is for the living, and just as the tiniest roots can crumble any edifice with enough time, we ramp our way into enough sunshine and rain to make our team bigger and bigger and bigger until we're a verdant cacophony, untamed and irresistible. We eat, we contribute, we collaborate, we have one directive: to grow. And when we do it together, we thrive. This is a good deck for both players who like to see their counters as an extra resource to be parlayed into value, and for players who enjoy having a big board of strong creatures that only get stronger. So, let's get into our game plan. I do want to mention first that this is a Moxfield page, and the link to this deck list is in the video's description. At the bottom of the deck, you'll see a section called Considering. These are cards that I thought about putting in and decided not to, but you always could. There's plenty of cards in there that I cut just because they were expensive, and I like to keep my budgets down. So if you already own those cards, or you don't mind a higher budget, you can build towards something maybe a little more powerful or more focused. If you're on a more of a budget than I am, you can find a bunch of cards in that section as well that will maybe not power down your deck, but maybe not give it as much synergy or as much strength all at once. There's lots of options, so check out the Considering section for that. So let's get into our actual game plan. I know you're surprised. We're starting with counters. And we have a lot of cards that I've tagged with counters. But like I mentioned, many of these cards don't just put counters on themselves, they spread counters around. Or they put counters on cards other than themselves. Because we want to be able to take a counter off of 2 creatures every time we attack. But keep in mind, Dyadrine says it's not just whenever Dyadrine attacks. It's whenever we attack, so we can attack with anything we want, including Dyadrine, but it doesn't have to be our commander. So, we're going to start with Mikaeus the Lunarch, classic Mike. For X and a white, we get a 0/0 legendary human cleric that says Mikaeus enters with X +1/+1 counters on it, and he has 2 abilities beyond that. We can tap him to put a counter on him, or we can tap him to remove a counter from him, and put a 1/1 counter on each other creature we control. So the classic play pattern with Mike is this turn, I'm going to tap him to put a counter on him. Next turn, I'm going to tap him and remove a counter to put a counter on everything else. We're just building up our board slowly. But there are plenty of ways to put counters on Mike in this deck beyond just tapping him to put a counter on himself. So we might be able to, every turn, put a counter on Mike, and then in that same turn, take that counter off by tapping Mike and putting a counter on everything else. That's what we want to do. We want to go big, go tall in this way as we've gone wide. Next up is Requisition Raid. This is a sorcery. It's really more of a removal spell in this deck. But the way that it works is it has Spree. So we have to pay white for it, and we also have to pay the cost of at least one of these other effects. We can choose any number of them, including all of them, but we have to choose at least one. So it's going to be white and a generic mana, or 2 or 3, depending on which ones we want to do. And Requisition Raid will destroy an artifact, destroy an enchantment, or put a +1/+1 counter on each creature target player controls. So yes, it's true. We could use that politically. We could say, it doesn't say on each creature you control, it says target player. So we could tell someone else, look, if you want your whole board pumped up, just leave me alone for a turn cycle or 2, and we won't have a problem. But generally, we're going to do this as a spend a white and another to pump up your whole board a little bit. It's just like one activation of Mike without having to take a counter off him. But if we want, in addition, we can use it as removal. Which one of these is going to be the one that we use more? It depends on the game you're in, so the flexibility is great. Next, we have Gala Greeters. I think this card is fantastic. For 1 and a green, we get a 1/1 Elf Druid with Alliance whenever another creature enters the battlefield under your control. And remember, we're running 35 creatures. Choose one that hasn't been chosen this turn. Either put a counter on Gala Greeters, make a tapped treasure token, or you gain 2 life. Typically, the way I play with Gala Greeters is until I have enough mana, I'm making a treasure token first every time this triggers each turn. And then it gets a counter later. If I've got a second creature that comes in, it'll get that counter. I might want to put the counter on first in this deck, but usually I need to ramp into big things so I can play a Dyadrine as a really big creature, or I have some other creatures I want to be really big as well. So making that treasure is usually the right choice, but it's not going to be the case that we're only getting 1 creature in every turn. And if we get a 3rd creature, we'll gain 2 life. And then this all resets the next time we have creatures enter, or rather the next turn in which we have creatures enter. Next up, we have Gyre Sage. For 1 and a green, It's a 1/2 elf druid with Evolve, which means whenever a creature enters under our control, if that creature has more power or more toughness than Gyre Sage gets a counter. And Gyre Sage can tap for a green for each counter on it. Now that's okay. That means Gyre Sage just doesn't tap for green until it has any counters on it. But those counters don't have to only be the ones that come from its Evolve ability. It's just they're likeliest to come from that. So if Mikaeus, for example, puts a counter on Gyre Sage, or Requisition Raid has, then Gyre Sage can tap for mana based on that. And hopefully it keeps getting bigger and bigger, and we can tap it for more and more green mana. Next we have Incubation Druid. Incubation Druid is great. This is 1 and a green for an 0/2 Elf Druid, with tap to add 1 mana of any type that a land we control could produce. And if it has any +1/+1 counters on it, instead, we add 3 mana of that type. So this is mana of any type, so if we really want, if we've got a land that produces colorless mana, we could produce 3 colorless with this. But generally, we're going to be producing, of course, white or green, based on whatever lands we have and what we're trying to cast. In addition, Incubation Druid has Adapt 3 for 3 and double green. What that means is we can pay 3 and double green at instant speed to put 3 +1/+1 counters on the Druid, as long as it doesn't have any counters other than that. Usually we can get a counter on our Druid without having to activate its adaptability. But if we do have to activate it, that's alright, it'll become a 3/5. Just remember that it can tap for 3 mana if it has any counters at all, whether or not it got them through Adapt or some other method. Next up is Inscription of Abundance. For 1 and a green, we have an instant that lets us choose 1. Or if we kicked it, which is to say we paid the kicker cost of 2 and a green, so paying a total cost of 3 and 2 green, if we kicked it, we get to choose any number of these. Usually you choose all 3. So the options are put 2 +1/+1 counters on target creature, target player gains X life, where X is the greatest power among creatures they control, or target creature we control fights target creature we don't control. So oftentimes this is a removal spell. This is a fight spell for 1 and a green. In this deck, a lot of the time it's 2 mana to put 2 counters on a creature. That's okay too. But if we can get 5 mana into this, then we can make something bigger, gain a bunch of life, which might be more life now that something is bigger, because it's based on the greatest power among creatures we control, and then one of our creatures, which we may have just pumped up with those counters, fights a creature that we don't control. Inscription of Abundance, again, flexibility is very strong. This is a pretty great spell for that. Next we have Luminarch Aspirant. For 1 and a white, we get a 1/1 human cleric that says at the beginning of combat on your turn, put a +1/+1 counter on target creature you control. This is a very small effect, but it really gets out of hand. It did in Standard, for sure. This counter can go on Luminarch Aspirant if we want it to. It can go on another creature. Maybe we put it on an Incubation Druid so that the Druid can now tap for 3. We've got lots of ways to take advantage of this, and it's just free at the start of combat every turn. Just keep adding counters to things. That's especially good because the beginning of combat happens before we attack. So if we need an extra counter on a different creature, so Dyadrine can have its trigger, we can actually pay for its trigger, then Luminarch Aspirant will let us do that. Next is Metastatic Evangel. This is from Modern Horizons 3. For 1 and a white, we get a 3/1 Phyrexian human cleric that says whenever another non-token creature enters under our control, we proliferate. Now, if you haven't seen proliferate before, we have a few sources of it in this deck, and the Evangel is one of the best ones. What it means is we choose any number of permanents or players, and whatever counters are already on them, it gets 1 more of each of those types of counters. Now in our deck, we're basically only using +1/+1 counters, with one other exception, which we'll see later. So what we're trying to do here is choose all of our creatures that have +1/+1 counters and give them 1 more of those. However, maybe one of our opponents is a jerk and they're playing poison. We can choose a different opponent who has taken some poison counters and proliferate those counters. They get an extra poison. If someone has, a Hapatra deck and they're running a bunch of -1/-1 counters, we can proliferate those as well. any kind of counters we see. Maybe we have an opponent who, like I say, is running -1/-1 counters, or they're running a charge counter deck, something along those lines. We can proliferate those, even if it's not to our advantage, as a political choice. Say, look, I can see you're trying to build up these charge counters on these stationed spacecraft that you're building up. I will proliferate that for you if you leave me alone for this turn, or if you help me out against this other opponent. And maybe you get to make that call every time you're playing another non-token creature. Pretty all right. Next is Throne of Geth. This card I think is good in this deck, but it does go a tiny little bit against the flavor. Throne of Geth is a 2 generic mana artifact that says tap and sacrifice an artifact to proliferate. Now I know you're thinking, we're not running that many artifacts, but Dyadrine sure is making robots, and robots are artifact creatures. So if we don't need our little 2/2 robot, what we can do is each turn after we've gotten our robot from removing counters, we've drawn our card, we can wait until blocks have been made, and then surprise our opponent by tapping Throne of Geth and sacrificing that robot that just came in, which isn't itself attacking, and proliferating all of our creatures that have counters on them. So we can turn our robots into a proliferate with Throne of Geth. That means we can kind of, as long as we've got Throne of Geth in play, treat Dyadrine's trigger as if it said remove a 1/1 counter from each of 2 creatures you control to draw a card and proliferate. So as long as those creatures that we took counters off of still have at least 1 counter, they get those counters right back. And any other creatures that have counters also do. Throne of Geth can definitely be swingy in the sense of being like not very good or extremely good. I think it's worth the include in this deck, even though it's not like another creature, or it doesn't put counters on its own without the proliferate effect. So yeah. Next we have Together Forever. This is a really cool enchantment. For double white, we get an enchantment that when it enters, we support 2. Support means we get to choose that many creatures and put a 1/1 counter on them. And it's up to that many. So if we only had 1 creature in play, so Together Forever will still put a 1/1 counter on it. But remember, support isn't bolster or any of the other similar mechanics. We can't put both of those 1/1 counters on the same creature. And then, for a single generic mana, we can activate its other ability, which is choose target creature with a counter on it. When that creature dies this turn, return that card to its owner's hand. So this doesn't cost much. It's like the absolute lowest we could pay other than, 0. This puts Dyadrine back in our hand so that we don't have to pay the commander tax, which doesn't hurt us that much because we can get extra counters for it, but we could do that anyway with the X in its cost, and we don't if we don't want to, we don't have to. Plus it works on any of our other creatures. As long as that creature has a counter on it, when it dies, we're going to be able to put it back in our hand, and we can activate this after blockers are declared, before damage is dealt. So we can wait until basically the last minute to spend this mana and ensure that, yes, we're going to have to rebuy those creatures, but we're able to. We don't have to worry about them going to the graveyard and then staying there. Now, obviously, this doesn't get around something like Leyline of the Void, or if in response to this, because this is a triggered ability that when that creature dies this turn, if a bunch of our creatures die from combat damage, then these triggers go on the stack for them to return, and our opponent exiles our graveyard, or eats those creatures with a scavenging ooze, or hits us with Tormod's Crypt or something. Yeah, we're going to lose those creatures, but we would have lost them anyway. If that's the case. In any case, Together Forever is very strong if our opponent doesn't have any graveyard hate, and we're not really a graveyard deck, so hopefully there's someone playing a graveyard deck that they'd rather use their hate against. Of course, Leyline of the Void stops that, but if we have a player with Leyline of the Void out, well, then Together Forever is 2 white to put a 1/1 counter on 2 different creatures. That's pretty on rate. I mean, it's probably more than we want to pay for it, but it's not too expensive. Yeah. Next we have Archdruid's Charm. A little bit of an expensive card in the deck in terms of currency, but it does so much for us. There's some other options we can use with it, but it's so flexible that I wanted to include it. For triple green, we get an instant that says choose 1. The first is search your library for a creature or land and reveal it. Put it on the battlefield tapped if it's a land, otherwise put it in your hand, then shuffle. So we can either ramp ourselves a little bit or tutor for a creature. It goes in our hand, sure, but yeah, whatever creature we may need, for 3 green, it's in our hand. Whatever land we may want, it's going to come in tapped, but it comes directly to the battlefield. The second option for Archdruid's Charm is put a +1/+1 counter on target creature you control. It deals damage equal to its power to target creature you don't control. So we put a counter on something, which we love in this deck, and then we bite. That creature will bite a different creature on the battlefield. So it's a removal spell. Or it's another removal spell because the third mode is exile target artifact or enchantment. Just a better version of Naturalize because it exiles. So Archdruid's Charm does so much for us in this deck. And again, a little pricey, but you can certainly swap this out for a different removal spell, or if you really want a ramp spell, like you could put Cultivate in instead of this. That would not be a bad choice. You just lack a little removal if you do that. That's all right. Next is Arwen, Weaver of Hope, from the Lord of the Rings Commander products. For 1 and double green, we get a 2/1 legendary elf noble that says each other creature you control enters the battlefield with a number of +1/+1 counters, number of additional +1/+1 counters on it equal to Arwen's toughness. What that means is Arwen's toughness right now is 1, so all of our other creatures come in with a 1/1 counter. If Arwen gets 1/1 counters herself, let's say she's got 2 counters on her, and she's a 4/3, then all of our creatures that enter after she becomes that 4/3 are going to enter with 3 counters because that's now her toughness. So very strong effect that can only get stronger in this deck because we've got lots of ways to put counters on other creatures. Arwen is just going to help us put more and more counters on things. Next we have Champion of Lamholt, a card that I run in basically every deck that works this way, just because it will win the game for us if it's not dealt with. For 1 and double green, it's a 1/1 human warrior that says creatures with power less than Champion of Lamholt's power can't block creatures you control. So that means right now, our opponent can't block any of our creatures that have power less than 1. So any of their 0/4 walls just can't block our creatures, not allowed to. And whenever another creature enters the battlefield under your control, put a +1/+1 counter on Champion of Lamholt. So the champion gets bigger on its own every time one of our creatures enters, whether it's a creature we play or one of these robots that Dyadrine will make. Which means, let's say we attack with one of our creatures, Dyadrine triggers, we remove some counters, we make a robot, Champion of Lamholt's power goes up by another 1. So it may have been that when we attacked, some of our opponent's creatures could block, but before we even get to blocks, now some of them can't anymore, because maybe Champion of Lamholt was a 3/3, and now it's a 4/4. So any of their creatures that have a power of 3 or less can't block our creatures anymore. Can't block any of our creatures. It's just very strong. Plus, we have so many ways to add more counters to our things, like support, or like having Arwen in play when the champion comes in, or by proliferating. So many different ways to make it so our whole board is unblockable. We attack en masse and just kill our opponent. Unless they have a way to kill the champion before blockers are declared, they're just going out. Next is Evolution Sage. For 2 and a green, we get a 3/2 Elf Druid that says when a land enters under our control, proliferate. It's that simple. The same thing as when a non-token creature enters under our control, proliferate. But Landfall Proliferate is so good. It's just so good in a deck where we have so many counters. And if we have just 2 different creatures that have counters on them, we play a land, we proliferate, we attack with Dyadrine, and now we take those counters off, draw a card, make a robot. Yeah. Evolution Sage is just here to be a sort of mirror to the Metastatic Evangel. Next we have Evolution Witness. For 2 and a green, we get a 2/1 Elf Shaman Mutant with Adapt 2 for 1 and a green. Like we saw with the Incubation Druid, Adapt 2 means if we pay 1 and a green, we'll put 2 counters on the Evolution Witness as long as it doesn't have any counters already. If it has any counters already, it doesn't give any counters. from us activating Adapt. But also, whenever one or more +1/+1 counters are put on the witness, return target permanent card from your graveyard to your hand. So we sort of get to do a little bit of regrowing. We can't adapt it if it already has counters on it, but we sure can put counters on it in other ways, like proliferating, or, the Luminarch Aspirant's trigger. But what's also interesting is, this might have a counter on it, and then we use Dyadrine to eat it off the witness. We take a counter off of the witness and something else as part of Dyadrine's triggered ability. We get our robot, we get our card draw, and now Evolution Witnesses, it has no counters on it. Maybe we just go ahead and adapt it again. Maybe in combat, when we attacked in order to trigger Dyadrine, one of our creatures died. And so after combat, we pay to adapt the witness, put 2 counters on it, those counters go on it, and we get that creature back from our graveyard into our hand with the Evolution Witnesses triggered ability. So lots of different ways we can use this, and this is one of the creatures that we it may be the only creature, in fact, in the deck that we kind of don't really care if we build up counters on it, just because when we put those counters on it for the first time, when we put more counters on it, it gets to get something back for us. But if we lose all the counters off of it, we can just adapt it back. Pretty okay. Especially because its adaptability is much cheaper than the Incubation Druids. So yeah. Next we have Fight Rigging. This is an enchantment from Streets of New Capenna. Love this card. For 2 and a green, we have an enchantment with Hideaway 5, which means when it enters, we look at the top 5, we pick one and exile it face down under Fight Rigging, and put the rest on the bottom of our library in a random order. And then, at the beginning of combat on our turn, we put a +1/+1 counter on target creature we control. That's the same trigger as Luminarch Aspirant. But then, as part of the same ability, if we control a creature with power 7 or greater, once we put that counter on something, we can play the exiled card without paying its mana cost. Which means if we exiled a spell, we can cast it for free right then during the beginning of combat step as part of this trigger. Or, if it's a land, we can play it. Generally, we're going to want to play one of our expensive spells this way if we've gotten one. When we hide away, we're going to look at it and see what the best thing we can get is, because it's not that hard to get one of our creatures up to 7 power, especially if we're choosing to eat tokens with Dyadrine off of other creatures and just let one of them get pretty big. Also, it's not hard for Dyadrine to become pretty big, so Fight Rigging can help us make Dyadrine a little bit bigger. Then we get that, once it has power 7, we can cast the spell under Fight Rigging. Then Dyadrine maybe attacks, and we can start eating counters off of it because Fight Rigging is only going to let us cast that one spell. But it still remains on the battlefield after we've cast the Hidden Away spell and puts counters on our creatures each beginning of combat. Next we have Glunch the Bestower from Baldur's Gate. Love this little flump. 1 and a green and a white for an 0/5 flying jellyfish that says at the beginning of your end step, choose a player. They put 2 +1/+1 counters on a creature they control. Choose a second player. They draw a card, and then choose a third player to create 2 treasure tokens. So this guy feels a little weird in this deck, but we're here to live, to spread the life around. And sometimes spreading the life around means to the table as well. Glunch is a group hug card. So we make a deal with our opponents, and we say, look, who wants to draw a card, who wants treasures, who wants counters, and we say, all right, well, what do you give me for it? What's the agreement? And if they say, well, you've got to give it to someone, we say, sure, I have to give it to someone, but I might give you the thing you don't want, Because I don't have to choose a creature of yours to put counters on, I just choose a player. So if you don't have creatures, or creatures that really care about having the counters, I'll give you the counters. But if you want this card draw, what will you give me for it, It's fair to say, I want to get the most out of these triggers that I can. And of course, that usually means for us, we're putting +1/+1 counters on our stuff. But we might want to draw a card, or we might just want that ramp for those treasures. Maybe it'll get us over the hump to get a really nice ramp piece out next turn. Glunch is so flexible and can make friends with people at the table. So yeah, it's also the case that maybe we choose to be the one player that doesn't get anything, because maybe it's worth it to us. Everyone takes something, so everyone leaves us alone for a turn cycle. That's an okay deal. Anyway, Glunch being an 0/5 flyer as well, that's a big butt. If we put a bunch of counters on Glunch, we've got a really nice blocker. Next we have Good Fortune Unicorn. This is an effect that we have a couple of different iterations of. Similar to Arwen, Good Fortune Unicorn is 1 a green and a white for a 2/2 unicorn that says whenever another creature enters under our control, we put a +1/+1 counter on that creature. So it's a little different than Arwen saying that creature enters with those counters. Good Fortune Unicorn is a triggered ability. Arwen is a replacement effect. The difference is, if we were to have, let's say, Evolution Sage. We've got Arwen in play, with no counters on her. We play Evolution Sage. Evolution Sage will enter with a counter, so it'll enter as a 4/3. Good Fortune Unicorn, if the Unicorn is in play instead of Arwen, Evolution Sage will enter as a 3/2. And when it enters, Good Fortune Unicorn will trigger and put a counter on the Sage. Sometimes that's relevant to us, sometimes not. It's just worth knowing, because for example, maybe our opponents have Cut Down in hand. Cut Down is a 1 black instant that can kill a creature with a total power and toughness of 5 or less. So if we're playing Evolution Sage and Arwen's in play, the Sage is going to come in as a 4/3. If we have Good Fortune Unicorn in play instead, we cast the Sage will come in as a 3/2, the trigger will go on the stack, and our opponent could respond to it by cutting down our Sage. And then it doesn't get the counter. So worth realizing that even though they seem like a similar effect, or they seem like the same effect, they're only similar, they're not quite the same. Next we have a Saga. This is Jugan Defends the Temple. For 2 and a green, we have a Saga with 3 chapters. The first one is create a 1/1 green human monk creature token with tap to add green. So it's a human monk rather than an elf, but it's basically a Llanowar elves, so a little bit of ramp for us. Chapter 2 is put a +1/+1 counter on each of up to 2 target creatures. What that means is, Chapter 2, empower Dyadrine to do Dyadrine's trigger this turn, because it's just going to be eating a 1/1 counter off of 2 target creatures, or two of our creatures. And then finally, Jugan Defends the Temple's 3rd chapter ability is exile this Saga, return to the battlefield transformed under your control. It comes back as Remnant of the Rising Star, a 2/2 flying dragon spirit enchantment creature. It has a couple of abilities, and it seems intimidating to look at all this text, but it's not actually that bad. The first one of these 2 is whenever another creature enters the battlefield under your control. So, same as Good Fortune Unicorn's type of trigger. You may pay X, and when you do, put that many counters on that creature. So if we had Remnant of the Rising Star in play, and we played our Evolution Sage, we could pay any amount of mana that we want to, and we'll put that many counters on the Sage. We get that same trigger if we then play Glunch, and then that same trigger again if we then play the Unicorn. Remnant of the Rising Star makes us pay for counters, but we can put as many on as we have the mana to spend. And Remnant of the Rising Star says as long as you control 5 or more modified creatures, Remnant of the Rising Star gets +5/+5 and has trample. So modified means any creature that has equipment attached to it, that has auras we control attached to it, or has counters on it. So if our Evolution Sage has a counter on it, it's a modified creature. If our Evolution Witness has counters on it, it's a modified creature. So if we have 5 of our creatures that essentially, have counters on them, Remnant of the Rising Star is now a 7/7 trample, in addition to whatever counters it has on it. Pretty fun. Alright, now let's talk about Kami of Whispered Hopes, and an interesting mechanical interaction. So Kami of Whispered Hopes is 2 and a green for a 1/1 spirit let's look at its second ability first. It says, add X mana of any one color, where X is Kami of Whispered Hope's power. So it's a mana dork. It taps for mana. In this deck, we're probably putting counters on it, so we're probably getting it up to, a higher power of any sort, so that we can tap for more mana. We put 4 counters on it. It's now got a power of 5. It can tap for 5 mana of any one color. That's pretty good. But here's its first ability, which we'll see in a couple of different ways, and there's lots of different versions of this effect that you can put into this deck, because this is what's called Hardened Scales. the way this works is, if one or more +1/+1 counters would be put on a permanent we control, we put that many counters +1. So one extra counter goes on it. This is a replacement effect. We're modifying an event. So let's say Good Fortune Unicorn is in play, and we play Kami of Whispered Hopes. The Kami will enter, the Unicorn will trigger, and put a 1/1 counter on the Kami. Except the Kami says if you would put a counter on something, you put an extra one too. So instead, the trigger from the Unicorn will put 2 counters in the Kami. So the Kami gets 2 counters and is now a 3/3. If Good Fortune Unicorn weren't in play, but Arwen was, does it still work? Because Good Fortune Unicorn says put the counter on it, and so does Kami of Whispered Hopes if it would be put on the permanent. Arwen doesn't say put. Arwen says it enters with those extra counters. So does Kami say that Arwen is going to let us have it enter with an extra counter? Yes, it does. I know you're wondering, but it doesn't say put, and isn't magic literal? Yes, it is. But let's do a quick check on the comprehensive rules. This is the rules for counters. It's rule 122. Specifically, we're looking at rule 122.6. Some spells and abilities refer to counters being put on an object. This refers to putting counters on that object while it's on the battlefield, and also to an object that's given counters as it enters the battlefield. So you're welcome to look up 122.6, at least at time of recording. That's still the rule number for it. But essentially, it means if you have a Hardened Scales effect, like Kami of Whispered Hope's first ability, anytime counters would be put on that creature, or it would enter with those counters, the Hardened Scales effect does apply. So it will be a replacement effect that modifies the event. So if we're playing Evolution Witness, and Arwen and Kami of Whispered Hopes are in play, and Arwen's power and toughness are 2/1, then Evolution Witness should come in with 1 extra counter because of Arwen's toughness being 1, but it will come in with an extra 1 on top of that from Kami of Whispered Hopes, so it will come in with 2 counters. And of course, it comes in with those counters, and there we go. Next up, from the Fallout product, we have Rampaging Yaoguai. This is X and triple green for a 2/2 bear mutant with Vigilance and Trample. This enters the battlefield with X +1/+1 counters on it. That is entering the battlefield with those counters, which means Kami of Whispered Hopes, if it is in play, the Yaoguai, or if, Arwen is in play, the Yaoguai will enter with an extra counter beyond just X. So it comes in with that many counters, and when it enters, we destroy any number of target artifacts and or enchantments with total mana value X or less. So it's not just one artifact or enchantment with that mana value, but if X is, say, 1, we can blow up any number of 1 or 0 artifacts or enchantments, whichever ones we choose to target. So say goodbye to your Soul Rings, or your Moxen, or any of your, is Chalice of the Void? Is that an X cost one? I think it is. Yeah, anything that costs X, it doesn't matter what they paid for the X when they cast it. On the battlefield, it has a mana value of 0. However, notably, this will come in with X11 counters, and if we have a different effect that modifies the number of counters, that doesn't mean it modifies the X. So if we only pay 1 for X here, this may come in with more counters depending on other creatures we have, but it will still only destroy things based on the X as we paid it. So if we want to blow up an Arcane Signet, we're going to need to pay 2 into X here, so that X in its calculations is still going to remain 2. Remember, however, it's any number that we choose to target. It doesn't have to hit our own stuff, or any of the stuff that our opponents control that we don't want to hit, either because we're being nice, or because maybe we've made a deal. Big Bear, Vigilance, Trample, eats things. Good removal. Next, Rishkar, Pima Renegade. This is a card that you see in every tokens deck. For 2 and a green, it's a 2/2 legendary elf druid that says when it enters, put a +1/+1 counter on each of up to 2 target creatures. So it can put it on itself, but it can't put both on itself. And then each creature we control with a counter on it has tap to add a green. So this is a bit of a ramp spell. If we have creatures that like Glunch, that we're probably not attacking with, as long as Glunch has a counter on it, we can tap Glunch for green. That might be pretty good for us. Pretty self-explanatory. Next we have Signature Slam. What a great card from Modern Horizons 3. For 2 and a green, we have an instant that puts a 1/1 counter on one of our creatures, and then each modified creature we control deals damage equal to its power to target creature we don't control. So if we have, we already talked about what it means to be modified. If we have 3 creatures with 1/1 counters, we can cast Signature Slam, put a 1/1 counter on a 4th one of our creatures, and then all of those creatures deal damage equal to their power to a creature we don't control. So this is a little bit of an expensive bite spell, but it comes with a counter, and it just annihilates something usually. Unless our opponent is playing Ghalta, or, I don't know, Charex, something huge, we're probably going to kill it, and maybe even then. Next is Thunderous Velocipede. It's a vehicle from Aetherdrift. For 1 and double green, we get a 5/5 vehicle with trample and with crew 3. And in case you're wondering how vehicles work, crew means at instant speed, you can tap any number of creatures with a total power of at least 3. And if you do, until end of turn, Thunderous Velocipede is an artifact creature with power 5/5. That's maybe something nice that we want to use. Maybe we want to turn this into an artifact creature by crewing it in order to have it gain some counters from a specific effect. Now, it won't enter as a creature, so Good Fortune Unicorn will not put a counter on it when it enters, even if when it enters, we immediately crew it, because it's not a creature entering the battlefield, so it doesn't trigger this effect. The same is true of Arwen, because Arwen says each other creature you control enters the battlefield. This is not a creature when it enters the battlefield. However, its most relevant effect is each other vehicle and creature you control enters with an additional +1/+1 counter on it if its mana value is 4 or less. So essentially the same thing that Arwen does if her toughness is 1. Otherwise, it enters with 3 additional 1/1 counters on it. So any of our creatures and vehicles, which I think we only just have the one vehicle, yep, just the Velocipede, any of our creatures that come in that have mana value 4 or less come in with a single 1/1 counter on them. If they have mana value greater than 4, they come in with 3 1/1 counters. That's crazy. That's a lot of good counters. We always like things that add more counters when that multiply our counters, but being able to ensure that things are entering with counters means we have lots of counters for Dyadrine to eat and give us card draw, make us a robot, keep our team growing. Next is Unbreakable Formation, a 2 and a white for an instant that gives all of our creatures indestructible until end of turn, but it also has Addendum, which means if we cast it during our main phase, we get an extra effect. That effect is that we put a 1/1 counter on each of our creatures, and they all gain Vigilance until end of turn as well as indestructible. So Unbreakable Formation, it's nice to be able to hold it up, and if we need to make our creatures indestructible because there's a board wipe during an opponent's turn, something like that, we can do that for 2 and a white. But what we hope to do is on our turn, cast it, give our creatures Vigilance and indestructible, and most importantly, put a +1/+1 counter on each one of them. This is just a great card that does so much for us. Warden of the Grove is next from the recent Tarkir Dragonstorm set. For 2 and a green, we get a 2/2 Hydra that says at the beginning of your end step, put a 1/1 counter on this creature. That's great. End of turn, it's a 3/3 for 3. Pretty alright. And then, whenever another non-token creature you control enters, it endures X, where X is the number of counters on this creature. Endure means either it gets to have that many counters put on it, or we make a white spirit creature token with that power and toughness. So for example, let's say we have no effects like Velocipede or Arwen in play. The Warden comes in, we wait until our end step, it becomes a 3/3 because it gets a counter put on it. Next turn, we play, let's say, Glunch. Because the Warden has 1 counter on it, Glunch will endure 1, which means we will either put a 1/1 counter on Glunch, or we will make a 1/1 spirit creature token. The spirit doesn't fly, but we get that token. If then we wait until our end step again and the Warden gets another counter, the turn after that, let's say we cast Rishkar rather. Rishkar will enter and endure 2 because the Warden has 2 counters on it, meaning either Rishkar will get 2 counters or the Warden is going to let us make a 2/2 spirit. And this just keeps going and going and going. It's consistently putting counters on one creature and on other creatures. We can use the counters from either one of those for Dyadrine's abilities. Next, oh, this card is so cool. Clay Champion is a mythic from the Brothers War. For X and 4 generic, we get a 2/2 artifact construct. This is the only other construct in the deck besides Dyadrine, so give it some thought. It says, Clay Champion enters the battlefield with 3 +1/+1 counters on it for each double green spent to cast it. And when it enters, choose up to 2 other target creatures we control, put a +1/+1 counter on each of them for each double white spent to cast Clay Champion. So let's just look at this the simplest way. Let's say X is 0. We have to pay at least 4. Let's say we pay 4 with all green. That means Clay Champion will enter the battlefield as an 8/8, because it will get 3 +1/+1 counters for the first 2 green we spent on it, and 3 more for the other 2 green we spent on it, which is a total of 6 counters, which makes it an 8/8. But if we instead cast it for 4 white mana, then when it enters, we're going to be able to choose 2 other creatures and put a +1/+1 counter on each of them twice. The first time for the first 2 white, the second time for the second 2 white. If we cast this for double white and double green, of course, it will enter as a 5/5, because the double green gives it 3 +1/+1 counters, and then we get to choose 2 creatures and they each get a counter. The reason this is great is because it has X in the casting cost. We generally don't want to spend an odd number on X, but let's say we spend, a total of 4 green and 2 white, because we can pump as much into this as we want with that X. That means it's going to come in as an 8/8 because of the 4 green, giving it 6 +1/+1 counters, and then we'll get to choose up to 2 other creatures and put a 1/1 counter on each of them. What we try to do with Clay Champion as much as we can is spend white in it, because we want to spread these counters around in our deck. It really helps. But it doesn't hurt to spend green on it, and our deck is about twice as much green as it is white. It's not exactly that, but we've got lots more green mana floating around to support that, so we're probably going to have a pretty big Clay Champion. But that means we'll have a lot of counters on it to take 1 off of at a time, and all we have to do is take 1 other counter off something else when we attack for Dyadrine to trigger. Maybe that other creature is Dyadrine itself, because Dyadrine is a 0/1, so we can take all of its counters off and it doesn't die. Clay Champion, really helpful in this deck. Next is Felidar Retreat. 3 and a white for an enchantment with landfall. When a land comes in under our control, we can either make a 2/2 white cat beast creature token, so extra creatures, or we can put a +1/+1 counter on each of our creatures, and they all gain vigilance until end of turn. So this is a little expensive for an enchantment, but as long as we have a land to follow it up with, every time we play one, we either get another friend or, more likely, put a counter on all of our friends, and they get vigilance on top of it. That's terrific. Next we have Mr. Babycakes, the Forgotten Ancient. For 3 and a green, we have an 0/3 elemental that says whenever a player casts a spell, you may put a +1/+1 counter on Forgotten Ancient. That's not just us. That's all of our opponents as well, a player. And it doesn't matter what kind of spell it is. So every spell getting cast, once Forgotten Ancient is on the battlefield, we're putting a counter on Mr. Babycakes. It's just getting bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger, until we get to the beginning of our upkeep. Because then, we may move any number of 1/1 counters from Forgotten Ancient onto other creatures. So we can take all of the counters on Forgotten Ancient, maybe we've got 8 of them, and spread them around evenly across all of the creatures on our board. But notice, it doesn't say, onto other creatures you control. Another way we can be a little bit political is say, look, opponent A is being really aggressive, we don't want them to hit us, so we're going to put a bunch of creatures on a bunch of counters on our creatures in order to protect ourselves. But opponent B, you could use a little protection too. What will you give me if I make your commander, at the very least, a bunch bigger by putting counters on it from Forgotten Ancient? At least then you'll be able to withstand the next attack from opponent A. Maybe your commander survives. That's a deal you could make. Doesn't come up that often, but who knows? Maybe they're playing a counters deck too, or maybe they have a deck that cares about power. Maybe they're playing a walls deck. It could work. Worst case scenario, we get to put these counters on our creatures, or we just leave it on Mr. Babycakes, and we have something huge and something we can take counters off of for Dyadrine's trigger. Next we have Lenore, Autumn Sovereign. I love this card. I actually kept the precon that this is the face commander for together. I know it's not very valued, but humans, Coven, counters deck, it's pretty fun, just straight out of the box. For 2 and a green and a white, we get a 0/4 legendary human noble with Coven. At the beginning of combat on your turn, put a +1/+1 counter on up to 1 target creature you control. So again, it's the Luminarch Aspirant trigger. Then, if you control 3 or more creatures with different powers, draw a card. So, as long as we're able to put the counter on a creature that makes it so the powers we have among our creatures is different, and we have 3 creatures with those different powers, we get a bonus card at the start of combat. That counter doesn't have to stay around. It doesn't mean that we have to keep having 3 creatures with different powers. We can eat that counter with Dyadrine to draw another card from Dyadrine's trigger, and of course, make a robot. Lenore also is great because Lenore is one of the only a couple of creatures in the deck, including Forgotten Ancient and Dyadrine itself, that has a power of 0, which means it's really easy to put a counter on Lenore and give it a power of 1. Or put a counter on something else and Lenore is contributing a power of 0, which is probably pretty different from the other powers we have on our battlefield. So yeah, Lenore really helpful as a card draw engine and a great way to add more counters just right when we need them, right before we attack. Renata, Called to the Hunt. I chose the Multiverse Legends printing of this, but the Theros Beyond Death printings are also beautiful. For 2 and double green, we get a star 3 legendary enchantment demigod with power equal to our devotion to green. So if you don't know devotion means you look at all the permanents you have in play and you count up the green pips in their casting cost. So if we had Forgotten Ancient, Lenore, and Renata in play, our devotion to green would be 4, because there's 4 green pips among them. Our devotion to white would be 1, because Lenore's contributing 1 white pip. But Renata only cares about green. So Renata's power, if these are the only creatures we have in play, would be 4. She'd be a 4/3. In addition, Renata says each other creature you control enters the battlefield with an additional +1/+1 counter on it. So it's the same as our Arwen trigger. It stays at 1 rather than increasing the way that Arwen's does. So Renata is another way to ensure that, I guess this is exactly the same as Good Fortune Unicorn, except the Good Fortune Unicorn, again, is a triggered ability and Renata is a replacement effect. In any case, it ensures that all of our creatures are coming in with counters on them. So that's something we can proliferate, it's something we can add to, or something we can simply just eat with Dyadrine. Next is Shalai, Voice of Plenty from Dominaria 2018. Love this set. Beautiful art by Victor Adame Minguez. So great. For 3 and a white, we get a legendary angel. Shalai is a 3/4 flyer that says you, planeswalkers you control, and other creatures you control have hexproof. So all of our creatures and ourselves can't be targeted by our opponents. The only thing that can be targeted is Shalai herself. Also, Shalai, beautiful, person of color angel. I love to see more of them. In addition, Shalai has another ability. For 4 and double green, put a +1/+1 counter on each creature you control. That seems expensive, especially because Unbreakable Formation can do it for 3 mana in addition to other effects. We have Requisition Raid that can do it for just 2 mana, but Shalai's is repeatable and is on a body, and that body is doing an awful lot for us. So being able to pump the large amount of mana that we have, because we have a lot of ramp in this deck, into pumping up our creatures is great. And again, we might not have Unbreakable Formation or Requisition Raid in our hand, but we have Shalai on the battlefield. Redundancy can't hurt for these kinds of effects. Next we have Sovereign Okanek Ahau. I hope I got that right. Let me know in the comments if I didn't, or if I did. Congratulate me, I guess, or chastise me. For 2, a green and a white, we have a 3/4 legendary Cat Noble with Ward 2 that says whenever the Sovereign attacks, for each creature you control with power greater than that creature's base power, put a number of +1/+1 counters on that creature equal to the difference. So if the Sovereign is attacking, and let's say Mr. Baby Cakes has 2 counters on it, we can put 2 more counters on Mr. Baby Cakes, because those 2 counters are giving it a difference in its power and its base power of 2. If we had something that was giving all of our creatures +1/+1 that not in the form of counters, like an Anthem, Glorious Anthem effect, it would still get a counter because that +1/+1 is raising its power higher than its base power. So this is really just trying to bump up our tokens in this or counters rather in this deck. But the Sovereign can do an awful lot more than that. So consider this card for your pump decks. Next is the Earth Crystal from the Final Fantasy set. For 2 and double green, we get a legendary artifact that makes all of our green spells cost 1 generic less to cast. Pretty good. Good ramp. However, it is a little bit of a non-bow with our commander, because Dyadrine cares about the amount of mana we spend to bring Dyadrine in. And if the Earth Crystal reduces that cost a little bit, that doesn't mean we get counters that we didn't pay for, because it's not based on the X value. The X value is just there for us to pay whatever we want in Dyadrine's casting cost. So the Earth Crystal gives us a nice... The only way that this is sort of relevant with Dyadrine is if Dyadrine, let's say, has died once. And let's just look at Dyadrine for this. Let's say Dyadrine has died and gone back to the command zone. Dyadrine, because of the commander tax, now costs a white, a green, 1 generic, and X. That 2 generic because of the commander tax. So we have to spend at least 4 on Dyadrine to get Dyadrine back out. We can spend more because the X stays there. With that, if we have the Earth Crystal in play, Dyadrine's cost is reduced by 1 generic. That includes the cost imposed by the commander tax. So Dyadrine then would cost a white, a green, a single generic, and X. It still doesn't get extra counters because of that, because the counters, again, are completely based on the amount of mana we spend to cast it. But if we're casting it from the command zone, the Earth Crystal means that we sure can spend 1 less if we wanted to and still be able to cast it. But the Earth Crystal is in the deck for other reasons beyond that. Obviously, it's able to ramp out so many of our green cards. It also says if 1 or more +1/+1 counters would be put on a creature you control, twice that many +1/+1 counters are put on that creature instead. This is better than our effect, our Hardened Scales effect that Kami of Whispered Hopes does. It is another replacement effect that works in a similar way, but rather than simply adding an additional counter, it doubles the counters. So if, let's say, we have, let's keep going with Arwen. We have Arwen in play, and we have the Earth Crystal. If we play Pima, or Rishkar, I'm sorry, or we'll say we'll play Glunch. Glunch would come in with 1 counter because Arwen's toughness is 1, but the Earth Crystal says it should come in with twice as many. So Glunch will come in with 2 counters. If Glunch comes in and Good Fortune Unicorn is in play, it will trigger and put 1, but doubled because of the Earth Crystal, to 2 counters on Glunch the same way. But what if Kami of Whispered Hopes is the card that comes in when we have the Earth Crystal in play? And we have, let's say, Good Fortune Unicorn. Kami normally would come in, Good Fortune Unicorn would trigger, try to put a single counter on the Kami, and the Kami's ability would say, oh, add 1 more. So it would get 2. But what if the Earth Crystal is in play as well? Which effect wins? Is it the Kami adding 1 counter, or the Earth Crystal doubling the number of counters? both replacement effects modify the same event, and so you can decide, because you are the one that controls the creature being affected by it, what order you want them to go in. So it should be 1. If we want, we can apply the Kami first and make that 1 into 2, and then apply the Earth Crystal and make that 2 into 4. Or, if we want to do it the other way, for some reason, we could say the Unicorn is trying to put a single counter on the Kami. We apply the Earth Crystal's replacement effect first to make that 1 into a 2, and then the Kami's effect to add 1 more to it so that it's 3 instead. Generally, we're probably going to want to apply them in an order that gives us the most out of it, which is to say 1 plus 1 times 2, rather than 1 times 2 and then plus 1. So worth noting, for the couple of different replacement effects we have that give us more counters, the Earth Crystal doubles them. So we can do the doubling last if we feel like it, when it comes to those effects all happening simultaneously. In addition, the Earth Crystal, for the same price as Shalai's effect, the Earth Crystal, we can pay 4, double green, and tap it to distribute 2 +1/+1 counters among 1 or 2 target creatures we control. Remember, those counters are affected by the Earth Crystal's second ability, its doubling ability. So really what we're doing is we're saying 1 or 2 target creatures of ours get 2 counters. If it would get more counters a different way, maybe we have another Hardened Scales effect like the Kami of Whispered Hopes, it will get even more. So yeah, and I know you're wondering, well, how many would it get in that case? Let's say Kami of Whispered Hopes is in play, Lenore is in play, the Earth Crystal's in play, we activate the Earth Crystal, we're going to put 2 1/1 counters on Lenore and 2 1/1 counters on the Kami, but then we apply the replacement effects. The best way to do it is to say it's not just 2, it's 2 plus 1 from the Kami, and then times 2 from the Earth Crystal. So instead of 2, we'd be putting 6 on both. So yeah. Next we have Cathar's Crusade, which goes crazy in this deck, especially if we have things like the Earth Crystal or the Kami of Whispered Hopes. Cathar's Crusade is 3 and double white for an enchantment that says whenever a creature you control enters, put a +1/+1 counter on each creature you control. Because this is an enters trigger, you will also put a counter on that creature itself. It doesn't happen before the creature resolves and hits the battlefield, it happens when it does. So that means if Dyadrine comes in and Dyadrine comes in with 4 counters, it's going to trigger, and we'll put a counter on Dyadrine as well as a counter on every other creature we have in play. If we had the Earth Crystal in play only, we would put 2 counters on every creature every time we have a creature enter. This is 5 mana, and it requires us to have any creatures enter to do anything, but once we do, we're off to the races. Defiler of Vigor is 3 and 2 green for a 6/6 Phyrexian Worm with Trample. That essentially gives each of our green permanent spells, it turns one of their green pips into a Phyrexian green mana pip. What it says is, as an additional cost to cast a green permanent, we may pay 2 life, and if we do, that spell costs a green less. It only reduces the amount of green mana. We can't use it for colorless mana. We can only do it for 1 because it's a single triggered ability. But yeah, I guess it's not a triggered ability. It's actually a replacement effect. But yes, in any case, it basically says if Defiler of Vigor is in play and we play Renata, Renata costs either 2 and double green, or we can pay 2 a single green and 2 life to cast Renata. But even more relevant, whenever we cast a green permanent spell, we put a +1/+1 counter on each creature we control. That is not the same as Cathar's Crusade, because this happens as part of casting. Let's say we cast Renata when we have Cathar's Crusade in play. Renata will resolve, hit the battlefield, and all of our creatures, including Renata, will get a +1/+1 counter from Cathar's Crusade. If instead we had Defiler of Vigor in play, we cast Renata, and Defiler of Vigor triggers, and all of our creatures get a +1/+1 counter, then Renata resolves and hits the battlefield. Does not get a counter from that, thanks to the Defiler. But a little bit of ramp in our green permanents. Maybe we were able to get Renata out for just 3 mana. We can pay that life. Next up, we have Halia. Halia? One of the two. Ascendant Cadet. This is from Edge of Eternities. For 2, a green, and double white, we get a legendary human soldier that is a 3/3 that says whenever Halia enters or attacks, put a +1/+1 counter on target creature you control. it can be Halia. She can come in and get a counter on herself. And whenever one or more creatures we control with +1/+1 counters on them deal combat damage to a player, draw a card. So that's not a card per creature, but it is a card per player that our creatures deal damage to. If we attack two different creatures, or two different players rather, with creatures of ours that have +1/+1 counters on them, and those creatures with counters on them do damage to those players, we will draw a card for each player damaged with the damage is dealt to. Halia is a great way for us to draw more cards, obviously, but she puts counters on things because she gets a counter on one of our creatures when she enters or when she attacks. So we might be attacking with her and getting a trigger from her and from Dyadrine. We can stack them in such a way so that we put a counter on something first, and then Dyadrine eats that counter. I'm going to make sure that I'm not lying to you about that. The way Dyadrine is worded, yes, Dyadrine is, its ability does not target, so we don't have to choose which creatures we're taking counters from until this ability resolves. There's also no intervening if. That means it wouldn't trigger if we can't do that. So yeah, Halia and Dyadrine, match made in heaven. Match made in the Edge? That seems true. Next up is Juniper Order Ranger. What a great card. For 3, a green and a white, we get a 2/4 Human Knight Ranger that says whenever another creature enters under our control, put a +1/+1 counter on that creature and a 1/1 counter on Juniper Order Ranger. So this is the same trigger as Good Fortune Unicorn, but instead of only putting a counter on the creature that entered, the Ranger gets a counter as well. They both do. So we play the Sovereign when Juniper Order Ranger is in play. Sovereign hits the battlefield, they both get a counter. Then we play Halia. Halia hits the battlefield, Halia gets a counter, and the Ranger gets another counter as well, because it's triggered a second time. The Ranger just keeps getting counters, bigger and bigger and bigger, which makes it a great source of counters for us to take off with Dyadrine's triggered ability. Next we have Colonian Hydra. This card is great. For 3 and double green, we have a 0/0 Hydra with trample, but it enters with 4 1/1 counters on it. So it's going to come in as a 4/4 essentially. And when it attacks, we double the number of 1/1 counters on each creature we control. So this attacks, assuming no other shenanigans, as an 8/8 trample for 5. If it doesn't die, the next turn it will attack as a 16/16 trample, because it will trigger as soon as it attacks. Plus it doubles all the counters on all of our other stuff. That's bonkers. For 5 mana, that's completely worth it, yeah. Next is Nissa's Judgment. This is a little bit of an expensive removal spell, but it's useful. For 4 and a green, we have a sorcery that says support 2. So again, we put a 1/1 counter on each of up to 2 target creatures. We can't put both counters on the same creature. And choose up to 1 target creature an opponent controls. Each creature you control with a +1/+1 counter on it deals damage equal to its power to that creature. So we've already seen this effect as Signature Slam. This is the same card, except it only puts a single 1/1 counter on it, on a creature, and it has all our modified creatures do that damage, rather than our creatures with just 1/1 counters, even though we're really only running modifications in the form of +1/+1 counters. As you can see, we have no enchantments that are auras, and no artifacts that are equipment. So those counters are the only thing. And this is 2 mana less, but Nissa's Judgment supports 2. So that means 2 more creatures, potentially, can do their damage, because we might have 2 creatures that don't have counters on them at all. So, like I say, a little bit of an expensive removal spell, but good redundancy, and even if we don't care about doing the damage, we're at least getting to put counters on our creatures. Next we have Skyboon Evangelist. This is a cool card from New Capenna. For 4 and a white, we get a 3/3 Bird Advisor with flying that enters and supports 6. So we get to put a 1/1 counter on each of up to 6 target creatures, other than it. Hopefully we have 6 creatures, but that's 6 more counters going onto the battlefield, which is, I mean, that's 3 different attacks by 3 different attack triggers of Dyadrines. But also, whenever a creature with a counter on it attacks one of our opponents, that creature gains flying until end of turn. So this is my answer to Abzan Falconer, which is a great card to run in a counter stack. I wanted to do, like I mentioned, more focus on cards that put counters on other cards. I want to spread out the wealth because that's what Dyadrine cares about. So instead of having all of my creatures with 1/1 counters on them be flyers, Skyboon Evangelist says all of my creatures with counters on them are flyers when they attack. A little bit more fair, so not as good for us. But Skyboon Evangelist costs only 2 more mana and flies on its own and comes with 6 counters that we can put on other creatures. So a little bit of a different take, but it goes to what Dyadrine is trying to do rather than just being a generic Selesnya counters deck. Along those same veins, Thundering Mightmare is really fun. This is a 4 and a green 3/3 horse spirit. Is the horse the spirit? Is the guy on top of it? No, I guess it's just the horse that's the spirit. Because here's how it works. It has Soul Bond, which means it says, you may pair this creature with another unpaired creature whenever either enters the battlefield. They remain paired for as long as you control both of them. So what that means is, let's say we have the Skyboon Evangelist in play. We play the Thundering Mightmare. It has entered the battlefield, so we can choose to pair it with the Evangelist. Then we play Colonian Hydra. We can choose to unpair these two and now pair the Thundering Mightmare with the Hydra, because it says whenever either creature enters the battlefield, either the Mightmare or another creature enters, we can change what the Mightmare is paired with to something that has just entered. And it says, as long as it is paired with another creature, each of those creatures, it and whatever it's paired with, has the ability, whenever an opponent casts a spell, put a +1/+1 counter on this creature. So that is Forgotten Ancient. That makes both the Thundering Mightmare and whatever it's paired with into Mr. Baby Cakes. You don't get the second ability where you get to distribute those counters, but Thundering Mightmare is getting the ability to get more counters every time any spells get cast by our opponents. I guess it's not exactly Mr. Baby Cakes because it doesn't trigger on our spells like he does. But the trade-off for that is it's happening on Thundering Mightmare and whatever other creature it happens to be soul bonded with. So yeah, I guess I should also mention, Soul Bond doesn't say you may pair this creature with another unpaired creature you control when either enters the battlefield. So if we really want to help out one of our opponents, we can sure bond the Mightmare with that creature, one of the creatures of our opponents. We can always stop that pairing whenever we want to, simply by playing another one of our creatures and using the Soul Bond, moving the Soul Bond to the creature we've played. But, the possibility for that kind of politicking, I guess it's there. And if we were to do that, remember, the creatures gain the ability whenever an opponent casts a spell, put a +1/+1 counter on this creature. That means that if our opponent controls the creature that's soul bonded with the Mightmare, that soul bonded creature will gain counters based on that opponent's, based on its controller's opponents, which means us. Whereas the Mightmare won't get counters based on us, and it will gain counters based on the controller of the soul bonded creature. A little complicated. Probably it's not going to happen, but it's worth mentioning because I don't know what your pods are doing. Maybe you're crazy. Next up, one of our more expensive cards in the deck. I thought a lot about getting rid of Virtue of Loyalty simply because Cathars Crusade does something kind of similar to it, but it's just very strong and reliable and can protect us a little bit. So Virtue of Loyalty is 3 and double white for an enchantment that says at the beginning of your end step, put a +1/+1 counter on each creature you control and untap those creatures. That untap is not nothing. We've got some creatures that we can tap for mana, but more importantly, if we've got a lot of creatures that are getting counters on them, which they just did from this trigger, being able to untap them means they can block. We're going to want to attack a lot because Dyadrine triggers on us attacking, even if we only attack with one creature. But if we want to attack with a bunch of creatures, get in a whole lot of damage, Virtue of Loyalty says, even if we play Virtue of Loyalty after combat, at the end step of our turn, we're going to get a counter on all of our creatures, and then they untap, so we've got counters we can use for Dyadrine next turn, but in the meantime, they're waiting around to stop our opponents from hurting us. And if that weren't enough, Virtue of Loyalty has an adventure. Ardenvale Fealty is 1 and a white for an instant. We can play this on our opponent's turns. Maybe the turn before we play Virtue of Loyalty on our turn. Ardenvale Fealty makes a 2/2 white knight creature token with Vigilance. So if we need an extra 2/2 with Vigilance to go with all of those 2/2 robots we're making, there it is. Next is Burke, Long Ear of the Law from Bloomborough. For 4, a green and a white, we get a 4/4 legendary rabbit soldier with Vigilance. Burke enters, and we put a 1/1 counter on each of up to 2 target creatures, so that's support 2. And then, whenever a creature we control with a 1/1 counter on it attacks, double the number of counters on it. So that's just great in this deck. And it's an attack trigger. So we can have that with Dyadrine. We can stack them in such a way so that our creatures with counters on them will double the number of counters, and then we can use Dyadrine to eat those counters off of it. Maybe we end up at a net positive. Maybe it ends up being that we had those creatures only had a single counter on them, so it doubles to 2, we take it off, and they're back where they started, but we get a robot and we get to draw a card. Pretty good. Finally, we have Sanctuary Warden. Sanctuary Warden, I think, is the only card in this deck that has a type of counter on it that's not a +1/+1 counter. For 4 and double white, we get a 5/5 flying angel soldier that enters with 2 shield counters on it. Shield counters are a special type of counter that have a specific meaning. That meaning is if this creature would take damage or be destroyed, if it would be dealt damage or if it would be destroyed by like a murder type effect, it doesn't receive that damage and it doesn't get destroyed, it just loses a shield counter. So if, for example, we were to say our opponent, I don't know, casts the fireball for 5 at the Sanctuary Warden, that amount of damage, the amount doesn't matter, the damage is prevented and the shield counter is removed. If our same opponent goes, well, fine, I'm going to Doomblade it, it is not destroyed, a shield counter is removed. If it loses all of its shield counters, it's no longer protected, but there it is. It also has this ability. Whenever the Warden enters the battlefield or attacks, so both, we may remove a counter from a creature or planeswalker we control, and if we do, we draw a card and we make a 1/1 green and white citizen creature token. So the Sanctuary Warden is great, and you can remove its shield counters from it to trigger its abilities when it comes in, when it attacks, whatever you like. But in this deck, there are just so many +1/+1 counters floating around, and Sanctuary Warden is inherently a flyer, like Skyboon Evangelist, or anything that happens to have counters on it when Skyboon Evangelist is in play and they're attacking. Just being able to have a 5/5 flyer that we can put +1/+1 counters on, but also has those shield counters to protect it, that's really strong. So I do my best in this deck to try and remove 1/1 counters from other creatures in order to pay for the Sanctuary Warden's triggered ability. And it works the same way with cards like Burke that I just mentioned Dyadrine would work. So maybe what we're doing is let's say Burke and Sanctuary Warden are both attacking, they both have counters on them, let's say. I guess Burke's actually not a support ability because support puts counters on other creatures, and we can put one of these 2 counters on Burke. In any case, let's say we attack with Burke and Sanctuary Warden, and they both have 1/1 counters on them. Burke, Sanctuary Warden, and Dyadrine will trigger. We can have Burke resolve first, doubling the 1/1 counters on Burke and Sanctuary Warden. We can have Dyadrine resolve, eat a single counter off of both of them, and then make a robot and draw us a card. And then Sanctuary Warden might resolve, and we could eat a 1/1 counter off of Sanctuary Warden or off of Burke, and we draw a second card, and we make a 1/1 white citizen creature token, green and white citizen creature token. So yeah, Sanctuary Warden is another great source of card draw for us, a great way for us to use our tokens for something beyond just making our creatures bigger or feeding to our commander. Really nice. So thanks for sticking with me through our game plan, which is a huge number of cards that do a lot, but mostly feature counters. So we have a few other sections that will contribute to our game plan, but before we do, I want us to go into the support section, which we've seen a lot of already. But let's talk first about our card advantage. I use the word draw here, not to represent cards that just draw other cards, but just as a shorthand for tagging purposes to mean card advantage. So we've already seen Archdruid's Charm. It's card advantage because it can tutor for a creature or a land. And remember, this land doesn't have to be a basic land. We've got several non-basics in the deck. Fight Rigging gives us card advantage because as long as we're able to have a creature power 7 or greater as part of this trigger, we can play for free the card we hit away. Garruk's Uprising is next. Garruk's Uprising is 2 and a green for an enchantment with 3 abilities. When it enters, if we have a creature power 4 or greater, we draw a card. When a creature power 4 or greater enters, well, this is in play, we draw a card, and all of our creatures have trample. So this is a great source of evasion that isn't just giving our creatures flying. In addition, it's a great repeatable card draw engine, because even though we have a lot of creatures coming in that are smaller and getting counters later, we also have plenty of creatures coming in with counters. So being able to have repeatable card draw from that is pretty great. And even if the only thing we do is we draw a single card when Garruk's Uprising itself enters, because Dyadrine is power 4 or greater, that still replaces itself and gives all of our creatures trample as long as this is on the battlefield. We've seen Glunch. Glunch can get us a card. Now let's talk about Growing Rites of Itlimoc. I used the Lost Caverns of Ixalan art for this because look at these little guys. Growing Rites is a legendary enchantment for 2 and a green that says when it enters, we look at the top 4 of our library. We may reveal a creature from amongst them, put it in our hand, and put the rest on the bottom in any order. So that means this puts a creature card into our hand. That's our card advantage. But in addition, at the beginning of our end step, if we control 4 or more creatures, which usually we will, we transform Growing Rites of Itlimoc into Itlimoc Cradle of the Sun, which is a legendary land that either taps for green or taps for 1 green for each creature we control. It's Gaia's Cradle. That's why it's Cradle of the Sun. So getting Itlimoc to flip is usually pretty trivial in this deck. So paying 3 in order to draw a creature and then at our end step have a Gaia's Cradle, completely worth it. I can't believe it's down to just $6.50 before they reprinted this in Lost Caverns. I don't remember how much it was, but woof. Next up is Inspiring Call. Inspiring Call is 2 and a green for an instant that says draw a card for each creature you control with a +1/+1 counter on it. Those creatures gain indestructible until end of turn. Inspiring Call is a great card draw spell, but it also protects our creatures. It only protects the creatures that have counters on them, but that's okay. Most of our creatures are going to, and Dyadrine almost always will. So being able to draw sometimes 4 cards for 3 mana, pretty amazing. Sometimes it's 9 cards for that much mana, and all those creatures are indestructible. Yeah. Pair that with Garruk's Uprising, and we're slamming in, and we don't have to worry about anything. Next, we have another LCI card, Kutzil, Malamat Exemplar. 1, a green and a white for a 3/3 legendary cat warrior that says your opponents can't cast spells during your turn. So if they want to get rid of our stuff, they're going to have to do it on their turns, or each other's turns. And whenever 1 or more creatures we control, each with power greater than its base power, deals combat damage to a player, we draw a card. So similar to the Sovereign, we care about our creatures having power greater than their base power, but this draws us cards every time we hit our opponents with those creatures. So any of our creatures that have a 1/1 counter on it, if it just does combat damage to a player, we're drawing a card. Probably that's going to happen every time we attack with Dyadrine. Next, also from Edge of Eternities, and I'm surprised this card is as cheap as it is, Terra Symbiosis. For 2 and a green, we have an enchantment that says whenever you put 1 or more +1/+1 counters on a creature you control, you may draw that many cards. Do this only once each turn. This card would be good if it just said every time you put a counter on a creature you control, draw a card. Do this only once each turn. But the fact that we can put 3 counters on a creature and draw 3 cards from Terra Symbiosis, that's crazy. Also, the way it's worded is, you may draw that many cards. Do this only once each turn. This is draw the cards, which means if we think we're going to have a creature get a 1/1 counter, and then later have a creature get 3 1/1 counters, we can choose not to put the counter, not to draw the card from the first creature getting a counter, and then draw the card from the next creature getting, or I apologize. We can choose to not draw a card from that first creature getting a 1/1 counter, and instead wait until the next creature gets 3 1/1 counters and draw 3 cards. We only can do this once each turn, and we have to decide at the time a creature gets 1 or more counters on it. But if we have an expectation to put more counters on, more than just 1 counter on a creature, we can wait and do that when we do that on that turn. In addition, there's a couple of effects we have in our deck that can put counters on our creatures when it isn't our turn. And it says, do this only once each turn, not do this only once on each of your turns. So Terra Symbiosis can draw us even more cards. This repeatable card draw is very strong. We've seen these other cards. Lenore will draw us a card if we have Coven at the beginning of combat on our turn. Halia will draw us a card whenever one or more of our creatures with 1/1 counters on them deal combat damage to a player. And Sanctuary Warden can draw us a card as part of its ETB or attack trigger by us removing a counter from a creature we control. It says creature or planeswalker, but we're not running any planeswalkers. Next, we have our acceleration section, which again, I'm just calling ramp for the simplicity of tagging. Everyone knows Soul Ring. 1 mana, taps for 2 colorless. We're good, we want to have it in our deck. That's just 2 more counters on Dyadrine. Arcane Signet is also great. 2 generic for an artifact that taps in our deck for either white or green. We want that. We also have Selesnya Signet as another 2 mana rock. It doesn't tap for white or green. It requires us to pay into it to tap it. But when we do, we get a green and a white. So we can't activate this if we have no mana to put into it, the way we would with Arcane Signet. But as long as we have at least 1 mana of any kind to put into it, we get both of our colors. We've already seen Gallagreators and how it can make treasure. Gyre Sage we've seen that can tap for green equal to the counters on it. Incubation Druid can tap for 1 mana or 3 if it has any counters on it. And of course that mana has to be a type that one of our lands can produce. Archdruid's Charm can ramp us by tutoring for a land and putting it on the battlefield tapped. Fertilid is so great in this deck. Love this Fertilid. Fertilid is 2 and a green for a 0/0 elemental that enters with 2 1/1 counters on it. And for 1 and a green and remove a 1/1 counter from it, we Rampant Growth. Or it could be another person. It says target player. Usually it's going to be us though. So we take a counter off it and pay the cost of Rampant Growth, and we get to Rampant Growth. Search our library for a basic, put it on the battlefield tapped, and shuffle. We can do that again and just let our Fertilid die as it goes to a 0/0. But probably we're going to have so many different effects that can put more counters on the Fertilid, and then we keep eating those counters off to ramp more and more and more. I'll give you a preview. Fully 20 of our lands in this deck are basics, so we can keep getting more and more of them to ramp ourselves with the Fertilid. And I know we have 17 here in ramp. That's by design. 1/6 of our deck is meant to ramp us, because we want to have so much mana that we can pump into our commander and pump into our spells as we draw cards thanks to our commander, that we can just keep rolling and rolling and rolling. So I went heavier on the ramp in this deck than I normally would, and that's the reason. Next is Glunch. Glunch can make treasures for us, that's ramp. Growing Rites of Itlimoc can become a Gaia's Cradle, that's ramp. Jugan can ramp us because Jugan makes us a Llanowar Elves in the form of a human monk that can tap for green. Kami Whispered Hopes can tap for an amount of mana equal to its power, that's good ramp. Rishkar lets all of our creatures tap for green, that's ramp. The Earth Crystal discounts all of our green spells by a generic mana. That's good acceleration. Defiler of Vigor, we can use our life to pay for green permanent spells in lieu of a single green pip. And then we have Karametra, which I believe is, it's not quite our last one. Karametra, God of Harvests, is 3, a green and a white, for a 6/7 legendary enchantment god with Indestructible. This is originally from the Theros block. As long as your devotion to green and white is less than 7, Karametra isn't a creature. So remember we talked about devotion earlier. Karametra cares about your total devotion. So if you have everything in this row in play, your devotion to green is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and Karametra's devotion is contributing 1 white to that as well. So 6 plus 1 is 7, so Karametra is a creature. As long as you have less than 7 total devotion to green plus white, Karametra is just an enchantment. She just stays on the battlefield, but she can't attack or block or be targeted as a creature or anything like that. In any case, she's always indestructible, and she always has this other ability, which is whenever you cast a creature spell, you may search your library for a forest or plains, put it on the battlefield tapped, and shuffle your library. So every time we cast a creature spell, before it enters the battlefield, we can tutor for a forest or a plains. We have 4 lands in this deck that are typed that aren't basics. Those will come in tapped anyway, not always, but usually. So going to find lands that fix our mana, if we don't already have them out or in our hand, Karametra lets us do that every time we cast a creature. We're getting to do better than a Rampant Growth, even though it's kind of like a Rampant Growth because it finds a land card and puts it in tapped. Love Karametra. And if we get enough Devotion, which we likely will, she's a 6/7 attacker, blocker. Put some counters on her, she's even bigger. Love this god. Finally, we have Hamza, Guardian of Arashan, from Tarkir. I think he was originally printed in a Modern Horizons set, but he's set on Tarkir. For 4, a green, and a white, we have a 5/5 legendary Elephant Warrior, but we're not going to pay 6 for a Hamza, because Hamza says this spell costs 1 generic less for each creature we control with a 1/1 counter on it. So in our deck, we might be paying just a green and a white for Hamza, getting a 5/5 Elephant Warrior. And what makes Hamza ramp is that Hamza gives all of our creature spells that same ability. All of our creature spells cost 1 generic less for each creature we control with a 1/1 counter on it. So this might mean, with a Hamza's out and we have enough creatures out with 1/1 counters on them, that we never pay a generic mana cost for our creatures. Again, much like the Earth Crystal, this can be a little bit of a non-bow with our commander, because the commander, again, only gets counters equal to the amount of mana we actually spent on it. But, just like with the Earth Crystal, this reduction can reduce our commander tax. So we might be able to recast Dyadrine multiple times without ever having to pay extra for the commander tax. However, even if we do, like I mentioned at the top of the video, Dyadrine gets counters based on the amount of mana we spent on it, not the amount of mana we spent on its casting cost, or on its printed casting cost. So if we are paying for the commander tax, we are getting counters for that as well. So that is our acceleration section. Let's take a look at our interaction section, which again I just call removal here for simplicity. So we've seen Requisition Raid and how it can blow up artifacts and enchantments. We have Path to Exile and Swords to Plowshares, which I usually introduce as saying they're almost the same spell. They both cost a single white, they both are an instant, and they both exile target creature. But they also both give a little kickback to that creature's controller. Swords to Plowshares lets that controller gain life equal to the creature's power. Path to Exile lets that creature's controller Rampant Growth. Search for basic, put it on the battlefield tapped, and shuffle. These are both excellent premium removal spells you want to use on the biggest, scariest things in the battlefield. Collective Resistance is next. 1 and a green for an instant with Escalate for a green, which means Collective Resistance, as opposed to Requisition Raid's Spree, we don't have to choose more than one of these. And we only have to pay for any mode that we chose beyond the first. So Spree makes us pay for each mode. Collective Resistance sort of includes one. Make sense with Escalate? Okay. I trust that all of you understand, and if you don't, let me know in the comments below and I'll explain it again. Maybe better. In any case, Collective Resistance is like an upgraded version of Naturalize, the same way that Requisition Raid is an upgraded version of Disenchant. We can either choose to destroy an artifact, destroy an enchantment, or give a creature hexproof and indestructible until end of turn. This is us protecting Dyadrine, or protecting one of our other creatures. Hexproof and indestructible is pretty great. The only thing it can't get around is mass removal that doesn't destroy things, like Farewell, or a mass bounce spell, let's say. Or, shuffling something into our library, shuffling all of our cards into our library, like some kind of crazy wheel all your permanents away spell. I'm sure that exists. But remember, it also says target creature, not target creature you control. So this is another way we can sneak in a little bit of politicking and say, look, your commander's getting destroyed, I can give them hexproof. What do you give me for that? Pretty okay. Inscription of Abundance, as we've seen, can have one of our creatures fight another creature, and we may even pump it up first. Good removal. Archdruid's Charm is removal because we can put a counter on something and then have it bite another creature. Emergency Eject, I've started using more than things like Generous Gift or Beast Within or Stroke of Midnight, just because what it gives the targeted permanence controller as a kickback is weaker than a 1/1 creature or a 3/3 creature. Now I know that Generous Gift and Beast Within can hit lands, but I don't typically do land-based remove, or land destruction, with one exception you'll see later in the land base. So anyway, I like Emergency Eject as a just destroy any non-land permanent for 2 and a white at instant speed, and its controller creates a Lander token. Lander tokens are Wayfarer's Baubles as tokens that they introduced in Edge of Eternities. It says pay 2, tap, and sack the token to Rampant Growth. Find a basic, put it in the battlefield, tap to shuffle. I think this is really great and better than making a token from Stroke of Midnight, because the Stroke of Midnight is a 1/1 human. They could block with that right away if they wanted to. I want them to have to pay mana in order to get a land out of it. So it costs us 2 more than Path to Exile, but it also costs them 2 more than the effective Path to Exile, and we're still getting rid of something. Even though it's not an exile, it can hit a non-land permanent. It could hit an artifact or an enchantment or a planeswalker. Pretty okay. Rampaging Yao-Guai can get rid of artifacts and enchantments again, maybe more than one, maybe a lot. Signature Slam and Nissa's Judgment both do damage to a single creature from multiple creatures of ours that have +1/+1 counters or are modified, which is in our deck basically the same thing. Pretty good. That's our support section. Let's talk about the last couple of categories to contribute, starting with our evasion section. Champion of Lambholt makes our creatures unblockable as long as their power is less than Champion of Lambholt's power. And Champion of Lambholt's power is only going to get bigger and bigger and bigger. Garruk's Uprising gives evasion in the form of our creatures having trample. Skyboon Evangelist gives an evasion in the form of all of our attacking creatures with counters on them having flying. And we also have Sigarda's Summons. I think this is just a fun card to have in the deck. For 4 and double white, we have an enchantment that says all of our creatures with +1/+1 counters on them have base power and toughness 4/4, have flying, and are angels in addition to their other types. Doesn't really matter that they're angels for us, but maybe our opponents will care about it. In any case, all of our 1/1 countered creatures have flying and base power and toughness 4/4. So that helps things like Kami's of Whispered Hope or our Arwen card to give more things, to tap for more mana or give more things counters when they enter, respectively. Not to mention, like, it makes Mr. Baby Cakes a 4/4 rather than an 0/3. Pretty okay. Flying is really what we have this for. Pretty good. I like this card. Next, we have our protection section. Protection, we have seen all of these, yeah. Collective Resistance can give a creature hexproof and indestructible. Inspiring Call can also give indestructible to all of our creatures with +1/+1 counters. Kutzil can makes it so that our opponents can't cast spells during our turn, which might protect us. Unbreakable Formation, it's sort of like a mirror to Inspiring Call. It also makes all of our creatures indestructible. And then Shalai gives us and our other creatures hexproof. Last section is Recursion. We've seen these two already as well. I just want to talk about them again. Together Forever. Recursion is, it's not protection. It's sort of protection after the fact. It's the ambulance at the bottom of the cliff. If our creatures with counters on them die, or are about to die, we can pay a generic before they die to make sure they come back to our hand after they do with Together Forever. And Evolution Witness, of course, just regrows our permanence every time we put a counter on it. So this is us getting card advantage in a way, but specifically out of the graveyard. Worth doing. That is all the spells in the deck. So we're going to finish up with our land base, and that'll do it for us. As I mentioned earlier in the video, we have 20 basic lands. This is more than twice as many forests, just because this is the best mix that helps out our curve. But of course, you could mix this up however you want. Maybe make it more even if you feel like you need it to be. It works for me. We are running a single bicycle land, the Scattered Groves. Bicycle lands are lands that are typed with the basic types. They come in tapped, but you can pay 2 to cycle them by cycle. So If we draw this late and we really don't need another land, especially a tap land, we can just pay 2 and cycle it away and draw a card. Or we can use Karametra or another card, which you'll see in a moment, to fetch this, because it has a plane and a forest type. So it comes in tapped, but Karametra would make it come in tapped. So it fixes our mana in a great way. We're running Selesnya Sanctuary because I love bounce lands. I think they're great in Commander. It comes in tapped, and when it does, we have to bounce a land we control to its owner's hand. That means if this is the first land we play, we have to bounce it, and that's not great for us. If we play a land on our first turn, pass, play this on our second turn, and bounce that first land, and pass, we're going to have to discard. Because in Commander, we drew a card on our first turn, which means first turn we draw a card, we're at 8, we play a land, we're at 7, we pass. Next turn, we draw a card, we're at 8, we play the bounce land, bounce that first land back to our hand, we're at 8 again, we go to our end step, we have to discard something. So not ideal. But after that, bounce lands mean we're going to be able to definitely hit our land drop the next turn because we had to put that land back in our hand, so we've got it in hand. And in any case, the bounce lands tap for 2 mana, 1 of each color. That's the big benefit of them. Really just, it doesn't ramp us at all because of the bounce effect, but it does fix our mana and ensure we have that land drop for next turn. Next up, we've got Sunpetal Grove. It's a check land, which means it taps for green or white, but it comes in tapped itself unless we control a forest or a plains. 20% of our library is basic lands, and we have a couple of lands that are forests and plains, even though they're not basics. So we have a pretty good chance of this coming in untapped. If you wanted to upgrade this, you could choose Overgrown Farmland, the slow land, because slow lands only come in tapped if they're the first or second land you play during the game. So most of your Commander game, they're going to come in as an untapped duel. A little bit more consistent than Sunpetal Grove, but more expensive as well. I like to run the filter lands, so Sungrass Prairie is here. It is the same thing as that Selesnya Signet, just as a land. We have to put a mana into it in order for it to tap for anything, but then it taps for 2 mana, the way that Selesnya Sanctuary does, fixing our mana. Next up, we have a whole fixing section. Let's talk about Command Tower. We don't have to talk about it long, though, because it's a land that does what Arcane Signet does. In this deck, it adds a white or a green, comes in untapped. Perfect. We also run Path of Ancestry because it is the same thing as Command Tower with 2 differences. It comes in tapped, so it's a tap land, but it taps for whatever colors we need, and whenever we cast a creature that shares a type with our commander, we scry 1. It bears saying, our commander does share a type with itself. So if we use Path of Ancestry to cast Dyadrine, we will scry 1 when we do. If we use Path of Ancestry to cast that other construct, we'll scry 1 then as well. If we use it to recast Dyadrine, we'll scry. Path of Ancestry is in here because it's a good duel and gives us a little bit of bonus. Usually it's a little bit better in a 3 or more color deck, but still okay in this one. We are running Temple of the False God because I think this card is good. It is a soul ring on a land, so soul land, except it doesn't tap for anything at all until you have 4 other lands in play. So it's not good early game, but after that, it's ramp. It's a land that taps for 2 without you having to put another land back in your hand. So Temple of the False God, very solid, especially in these kinds of decks. If you're playing more competitively, probably you don't want to run Temple of the False God but I mean, in that case, you're running fetches and shocks and stuff. You're playing powerful lands. You might be playing Ancient Tomb, who knows? Then we have Crow's Verge. Crow's Verge is so good in this deck. It enters tapped. This is our Myriad Landscape for this deck, and you could actually run Myriad Landscape if you really want to for more ramp, but this is another ramp land. It comes in tapped, it taps for colorless, or we can pay 2, tap it, and sacrifice it to search for a forest and a plains, and put them both on the battlefield tapped and shuffle our library. So that is getting us a tap land, and it is making us sacrifice a land and pay 2 mana to do all this, but at the end of that process, we have 2 lands in play when we only used 1 land drop. So that's ramp. In addition, like I mentioned before, the same way Karametra works, it's finding us a forest or a plains. So one of those lands could be Scattered Groves. It doesn't have to be a basic, because Scattered Groves is a forest and a plains. We have a couple of other typed duels that we'll see in a moment. Crow's Verge, just like Karametra, is here to find them. Next, we have our Pain land, the Brush land. It's an untapped dual. We can use it for generic mana or for colorless mana if we want to. And if we really need the color, we're willing to take the damage for it. We'll get it back. Or we'll get them before they get us. I love the pathways, so I like to run them. Pathways are modal double-faced cards, so we can either play it as Branchloft Pathway, which is an untapped green source, or as Boulderloft Pathway, which is an untapped white source. We just flip it over. We also have Canopy Vista. It's a Tango land, because the Tango lands are the old slow lands. They enter tapped unless you control 2 or more basic lands. That's not to say typed lands, basic. But again, 20% of our library is basic lands. So they're called Tango lands rather than the slow lands nowadays because it takes 2 to tango. In any case, it's also a forest or plains. It's a forest and plains rather. So Crows and Verge and Karametra can find Canopy Vista. We're also running these other 2 typed duels. These are not as exciting as Canopy Vista or as Scattered Groves, but they are typed. So Arctic Treeline and Radiant Grove are the same card. They're just typed forest plains that come in tapped. The only difference is that Arctic Treeline is a snow land, which our deck doesn't care about. Although it is beautiful. Elena Danner? Yeah, that's her name. Very, very good. Yes, so we can also find these with Karametra or with Crows and Verge. Finally, we've got 5 utility lands. We're going to start with Bonder's Enclave, where I'm using the Stellar Sights frame because Edge of Eternities commander. Bonder's Enclave taps for colorless, or we can pay 3 and tap it to draw a card if we control a creature with power 4 or greater. Usually we will. Usually it's our commander. So 4 mana, essentially, 3 and then tapping this to draw. It might be something we need to do if we're really trying to even out our draws. We usually have enough draw in this deck, not just because of all of those card advantage spells, but because our commander lets us draw repeatedly. But in case we need it, we're probably going to be able to qualify for it with the Enclave. I mentioned before that I don't run things like Generous Gift or Beast Within because I don't want to do land destruction. Demolition Field is my exception. It taps for a colorless, or we can pay 2, tap and sack it to blow up a non-basic land that our opponent controls, and then they get to find a basic and put it into play untapped, and then so do we. So we're not down a land after this, we're just down 2 mana. And they have lost their non-basic, but they get a basic out of it. They're not down any lands, and at least we've dealt with their Rogue's Passage or their Glacial Chasm or their Bonder's Enclave maybe. Something that's giving them more advantage than we want them to have, or even stopping our attacks, like Mazavith might be, or Glacial Chasm. I always hold up Glacial Chasm because I have a friend that plays it. Next is Gavany Township. This is an effect we've seen in a couple of different places in the deck, and it's a little expensive here, but it's on a land. Tap for colorless, or we can pay 2, a green, a white, and tap it to put a 1/1 counter on each of our creatures. That's a lot of mana, but it's a lot of power, a lot of counters based on what we have in play. And just like you might expect, we can do this at instant speed. We might want to do it before we attack and get the Dyadrine trigger so that we can use those counters to pay for the trigger. But we can also do this to surprise our opponents with a board that's bigger than they thought it was after they've blocked. Next we have Mossfort Bridge. Much like Fight Rigging, this is a hideaway card. It comes in tapped, and it has Hideaway 4. So we look at the top 4, we can exile 1 of those cards face down underneath it, and put the others on the bottom in a random order. Mossfort Bridge, once it untaps, will tap for green, or we can pay a green and tap it to play the exiled card for free if we have creatures with a total power of 10 or greater, which at some point we will. It might just be our commander has a power of 10 or greater. And then we tap a green source and Mossfort Bridge, and we can cast a spell for free from under this. Or it says play the exiled card, so if we have a land under there, we might do that. Usually we want to try and, like I said, and put a good spell underneath it, but maybe we hit 4 lands. Well, just put a land under it, and eventually we're going to be able to get that land out, and technically it's ramp. Maybe we've made a land drop already that turn, then we pay the green and tap this when we have creatures with total power 10 or greater, and we get that other land out. Pretty good. Oh, I'm sorry, we can't actually ramp with it because it says play it, so we'd need our land drop to play it. But in any case, we haven't completely missed if we hit just 4 lands. Finally, we've got Rogue's Passage. Rogue's Passage is in here because our commander can get absolutely insanely big, not just by pumping so much mana into it, but also by pumping it up with continual effects like Cathar's Crusade, or even just Luminarch Aspirant, cards that are letting us put more counters on our commander. If we can use Rogue's Passage to tap for colorless, or we can pay for and tap it to make a creature unblockable this turn. Maybe that's enough for one of our creatures to do a lot of damage to our opponent, but it's very feasible that Dyadrine might become 21 power, in which case Rogue's Passage means if they don't remove Dyadrine, they just die from commander damage. It's not our actual strategy, but one card in this deck that the cost of inclusion is so low because it's just a land, yeah, we're going to do that. So that about sums it up. Again, I'm releasing new Edge of Eternities commander decks every Thursday until the Spider-Man set drops at the end of September, so let me know in the comments if you'd like to see a specific commander or a deck style with that commander. Thanks for watching, everyone. Make sure to like and subscribe, and remember, Magic is fun. You should play more Magic.